It was a quiet Saturday morning in Kansas City. The early winter air hung still over the city like a breath waiting to exhale. In the calm before sunrise, most households were just beginning to stir. Coffee brewing, televisions flickering on, children still curled beneath thick blankets. Then came a call that would rupture that silence forever. At exactly 7:50 a.m. on December 1st, 2012, a 911 operator picked up a panicked phone call from the parking lot of the Kansas City Chiefs training facility, Arrowhead Stadium. The voice on the other end was male, shaken, breathless, barely forming words. He, he shot himself. He shot himself in the head, right in front of me. Dispatchers scrambled units to the location. The call had come from a high-ranking official within the Chiefs organization. First responders were told to expect a suicide. What they weren't yet aware of was that the body now lying still in the parking lot belonged to 25-year-old Jovan Belcher, starting linebacker for the Kansas City Chiefs, and a name known throughout the NFL. Less than 10 minutes later, police received a second report. Another shooting. This time it was from a residential neighborhood just 5 miles away, at a house Belcher shared with his longtime girlfriend, 22-year-old Cassandra Perkins, and their infant daughter. Inside, officers found Perkins on the bedroom floor, lifeless. 9 gunshot wounds, no signs of forced entry, no signs of a struggle. Their 3-month-old daughter, Zoe, lay crying in her crib just feet away. The sudden, violent deaths of 2 young parents, one at home, the other at a football stadium, didn't just send shockwaves through Kansas City. It would become a national headline by noon. But beneath the sensationalism, beyond the tragedy of a murder-suicide, there were questions that no one seemed able to answer. What led a professional athlete, by all appearances stable, beloved by teammates and recently a father, to kill the mother of his child? What had happened in those final hours? The answers would not come quickly. In fact, they would not come easily at all. What emerged was a story not just of domestic tragedy, but of unspoken trauma, hidden tensions, and the potentially deadly collision between fame, mental health, and violence. A story with victims on all sides, and a baby girl left behind in the wake of it all. By the end of the day, television crews had parked outside the stadium, police tape cordoned off a family home, and a football game scheduled for the next morning still hung in the balance. Players and coaches were being questioned. Families were being notified. No one had seen it coming, or so they claimed. But in the shadows of both scenes, one domestic, one professional, there were patterns, signs, unspoken fears, and for investigators, the puzzle was only beginning. This wasn't just the story of a man who snapped. It was a case that would force the world to confront uncomfortable truths about masculinity, about control, about what we overlook in the people we think we know. Jovan Belcher's name would soon be etched into headlines as the NFL player who killed his girlfriend before taking his own life. But in truth, the story began long before he pulled the trigger. And to understand why, we must go back, not to the moment of the shooting, but to the fragments of a life unraveling beneath the surface. To those who watched from the stands, Jovan Belcher was the embodiment of the American football dream. At 6 feet 2 inches and over 220 pounds, he moved like a force of nature on the field. Swift, calculated, disciplined. The jersey he wore bore the number 59, but to fans, coaches, and sports commentators, it symbolized more than just a position. It symbolized work ethic, determination, and an underdog story that had, against all odds, risen to the top. Belcher wasn't drafted out of college. He'd walked into the NFL with no promises, no guarantees, and still earned his spot. Coming out of the University of Maine, he had made his name on effort alone. While others had their paths paved by recruitment agencies and flashy stats, Belcher fought for every inch of ground. His climb to Kansas City Chiefs starting linebacker wasn't just admirable, it was seen as aspirational. But beneath the public persona, beneath the awards, the applause, and the carefully constructed narrative of discipline, lay another story. One that was quieter, less dramatic, and infinitely more human. One that, like the pressure building inside a fault line, had been shifting silently for years. Born in 1987 in West Babylon, New York, Belcher was raised by his single mother, Cheryl Shepard. By all accounts, she was a strong woman, fiercely protective of her son, and intent on giving him a path out of hardship. She was the bedrock of his childhood, while his father remained absent. Teachers described Jovan as intelligent and focused. He wasn't the type to seek trouble, but he wasn't immune to pressure either. Those who knew him early on say he was quiet, respectful, a bit reserved. He kept things inside. That habit would follow him into adulthood and ultimately into the dark corners of a life that began to fracture behind closed doors. When he entered the NFL, Belcher became part of a system that celebrates toughness, aggression, and emotional resilience, sometimes at the cost of mental health. He began to change. Friends noticed he was more withdrawn. Coaches said he was intense, sometimes overly so. But in the culture of football, intensity is not a red flag. It's a compliment. In 2010, 2 years before the shooting, Belcher met Cassandra Perkins through mutual friends. She was bright, outgoing, ambitious. Raised in Texas, she'd moved to Kansas City in search of opportunity and independence. The two quickly became serious. Not long after, they moved in together. And in 2012, they welcomed a daughter, Zoe. Outwardly, the image was perfect. A young couple, newly parents, building a life. But inside the walls of their home in the quiet suburb of Independence, Missouri, tensions were mounting. Family members on both sides would later describe their relationship as volatile. There were arguments, long silences, reconciliations followed by more fights. Like many young couples adjusting to the demands of parenthood, they struggled. But the difference here wasn't just emotional, it was psychological. In the months leading up to the tragedy, Belcher's behavior began to shift in subtle but unmistakable ways. He was drinking more frequently. Teammates said he was showing up late to practice. He was sleeping at the training facility some nights instead of going home. And he had begun making disturbing comments, vague, cryptic statements that hinted at inner turmoil. Yet no one, not even those closest to him, could fully grasp what was happening. Part of the issue was cultural. In the world of professional sports, particularly football, there's an unspoken expectation to endure. Pain, whether physical or emotional, is part of the game. You take the hit, shake it off, and push forward. Admitting vulnerability is often seen as weakness, and weakness can cost you your spot, your respect, your career. So Belcher pushed it down. Whatever was building inside him, grief, frustration, fear, he didn't speak of it, and no one asked hard enough to make him open up. After the incident, when police began collecting background information, they found little to suggest any premeditated violence. No criminal history, no prior domestic abuse reports, no weapons charges. But absence of a record doesn't always mean absence of risk. Sometimes the danger lies in what hasn't been documented. Emotions never processed, conflicts never resolved, pain never named. What is perhaps most haunting is the sense of almost. Almost reached out, almost asked for help, almost left the relationship, almost changed course. A timeline would later be reconstructed. The night before the murder-suicide, Belcher had attended a concert with friends while Cassandra stayed home with their daughter. Witnesses said they had argued earlier that day. The subject? Her attending the concert without him. Police reports later mentioned that Belcher had picked her up afterward, and they returned home sometime after 1 a.m. What occurred between then and 7:50 a.m. remains in many ways unknowable. But something had shifted, something had snapped, and the next morning, 2 lives were gone, one taken, one surrendered. In the days following the incident, NFL representatives, mental health experts, and domestic violence advocates began to speak out. Everyone wanted to understand how it happened, how a man with no known history of violence could commit such a brutal act, how a relationship filled with love could turn deadly, and perhaps most devastating of all, how it could have been prevented. Because behind every tragedy is a chain of missed chances, moments where intervention could have mattered. But the deeper issue, perhaps, is the way society still struggles to see beyond the surface of men like Jovan Belcher. Men taught to endure rather than express, to perform rather than process, to protect others, even as they lose themselves. The man with iron shoulders was never invincible. He just never let anyone see where it hurt. The two-story home at 5401 Chrysler Avenue sat in eerie stillness as law enforcement arrived. It was just past 8 a.m. on December 1st, 2012. Yellow police tape cordoned off the yard, fluttering slightly in the wind as patrol cars and emergency response units moved into position. Neighbors stood behind their curtains, their eyes filled with quiet dread, watching as uniformed officers stepped past the welcome mat of a house that, just hours before, held the ordinary chaos of new parenthood. Inside, the silence was not peaceful. It was hollow, heavy, an absence that clung to the walls. First responders made their way through the front door, weapons drawn but tension tempered. They had been dispatched on a suspected shooting. No sounds of struggle, no shouting. Just a report from the stadium that had mentioned something terrifying. Something about a confession. In the master bedroom they found her, 22-year-old Cassandra Perkins, lying prone, her body partially twisted to the side, as if she had turned to flee but hadn't gotten far. A small pool of blood spread beneath her. 9 bullet wounds had torn through her chest, neck, abdomen, some close range. No signs of defensive wounds. It was clinical, precise, almost detached. No windows were broken. The lock on the door was intact. Nothing in the house had been disturbed. Her handbag sat on the kitchen table. Her cell phone lay just inches from her outstretched hand. On the couch, a folded baby blanket. In the corner of the room, a white crib, and inside it, a 3-month-old infant girl, alive, crying, her tiny fist clenched as though sensing the rupture that had just occurred in the universe she had barely begun to know. The first officer on scene gently lifted the baby from the crib and handed her to a paramedic. She was physically unharmed. That fact did not bring relief. It only deepened the horror. Cassandra's mother had spoken to her the night before. A brief phone call. Nothing alarming. She sounded tired but content. There had been a concert that evening she had planned to attend. A chance to take a short break from the rigors of new motherhood. But sometime during the night, something shifted. The next morning, she would never wake again. As detectives began their survey of the house, it became clear that this was not a random act of violence. There were no signs of forced entry, no missing valuables, no struggle. The breakfast dishes were still in the sink. 2 coffee mugs, one with lipstick stains, one untouched. The television in the living room was turned off, but the remote sat crooked on the armrest, suggesting someone had just set it down. Police took photographs of every inch of the scene. Blood spatter patterns were studied. The trajectory of the bullets mapped. Shell casings were collected, each one cataloged with precision. It was methodical, as crime scenes always are. But beneath the process was the chilling reality. Someone in this home had fired those shots at close range, and someone else had died without ever knowing why. In the back bedroom, a folded baby onesie lay neatly on the dresser. A lullaby CD was still in the stereo. Next to the nightstand, a bottle of baby lotion, uncapped. The details were small, domestic, achingly human, but they painted a portrait more vivid than any photograph ever could. This was a place of young life, halted mid-breath. The mother of the shooter, who had been living with the couple to help care for the baby, would later confirm she was present at the time of the shooting. Her 911 call, placed just moments after the gunfire stopped, was filled with desperation. But she did not, in those first panicked moments, identify the shooter by name. Nor did she mention any argument, any lead-up. Only that a woman had been shot and that she needed help. Fast. Investigators took her statement later that day. What she told them would eventually become critical to the case. But at that moment, the team's focus shifted from the home to the stadium. 2 connected scenes, 2 lives gone, and an infant left in between. Detectives retrieved text messages from Cassandra's phone. Her last texts were sent at 1:33 a.m. Short, casual exchanges with a friend about the concert. There was no indication she felt unsafe. No cryptic messages, no last goodbyes. What did catch investigators' attention, however, was a small spiral-bound notebook found beneath the bed. A journal of sorts. Its entries were sporadic. Thoughts about being a new mother, plans for the future, expressions of exhaustion, but also joy. Her final entry, dated just 3 days earlier, ended with a line that would later haunt those who read it. "I think we're getting better. He's trying. I'm trying. Maybe that's enough." It wasn't. Forensics confirmed that the murder weapon was legally owned. No serial number had been filed off. No attempts were made to cover up the crime. In fact, nothing about the scene suggested panic. That calmness, to seasoned investigators, was the most unsettling detail of all. By mid-afternoon, the coroner had pronounced Cassandra Perkins dead at the scene. The press was already picking up the story, spinning theories faster than the evidence could support. Phrases like NFL tragedy and shocking murder-suicide began circulating, though authorities had yet to confirm anything officially. What the public didn't yet know was that the investigation had barely begun, that the real story, the one that didn't fit cleanly into a press release, was more complicated, more tragic, and more reflective of a society still struggling to understand what happens behind closed doors in homes that look like everyone else's. This wasn't just a crime scene. It was a mirror, a quiet indictment of what we choose not to see. The house on Chrysler Avenue would never be just a house again. As the sun began its slow ascent over Kansas City, television vans idled outside the Chiefs' Arrowhead Stadium. Reporters, clutching steaming cups of coffee in gloved hands, murmured into cell phones and adjusted earpieces, prepping for what would be a grim and unexpected press briefing. At first, there was confusion. A player was dead. A woman, reportedly his partner, had also been found shot. The word suicide was mentioned, but no names had been confirmed. Within hours, however, the media frenzy would escalate into full-blown national attention. Headlines sprawled across news tickers and mobile alerts. NFL linebacker involved in double tragedy. The media descended like a tidal wave, first local, then regional, then national. But what made this different from another tragic headline was not just the notoriety of the individual involved. It was the layered, intimate violence of the crime itself. Behind the stadium walls, the Kansas City Chiefs organization was thrown into chaos. Coaches, executives, and players were pulled aside by law enforcement. Interviews began. Statements were requested. Cell phones were temporarily confiscated for timeline verification. And in quiet, solemn rooms, teammates who had practiced alongside the man, now being discussed in past tense, tried to comprehend the unthinkable. The team's general manager and head coach were among the first witnesses questioned. They had been present in the stadium parking lot earlier that morning. Their accounts were restrained, factual, measured, but the weight of what they had witnessed could not be concealed in their voices. One of them described seeing a man in shock unraveling before our eyes, yet somehow calm, like someone carrying out the last step in a rehearsed routine. He had thanked them, not screamed, not cursed. He had said, "Thank you," and then with one final motion, ended his own life. The shock in their faces wasn't just from the violence. It was from the sheer contradiction of it. How could a man who had shown no signs of immediate danger, who had laughed in locker rooms and gone through reps with quiet determination, commit such a final, irreversible act? Law enforcement began working the dual scenes, home and stadium, like pieces of a complex puzzle. They created parallel timelines tracking minute-by-minute movements in the hours before the shootings. Neighbors on Chrysler Avenue were interviewed. Some reported having heard shouting the previous evening. Brief, muffled, then silence. One mentioned seeing a car pull into the driveway around 1:30 a.m. Another recalled hearing what might have been something falling, maybe a door slamming, around 7 a.m. But there had been no screams, no alarms, only in hindsight, tension that no one thought much of at the time. Police obtained security footage from nearby businesses and residential doorbell cameras. The grainy visuals captured a car leaving the Belcher residence around 7:35 a.m. It drove steadily, no swerving, no signs of haste. The driver's identity was confirmed through comparison with footage at the stadium, though authorities had not yet publicly named the deceased at the time. In parallel, forensic teams continued their deep examination of the house. Ballistic analysis confirmed that the weapon used in the shooting of Cassandra Perkins was a legally registered handgun. No attempt had been made to discard it or wipe prints. Everything about the scene pointed toward a crime committed with clear intent. But what was still missing was context, motive, catalyst. So investigators turned to the people who knew the couple best. Family members painted a complex picture. According to those close to her, Cassandra had been loving but private. She had adapted quickly to life as a new mother, though the transition had not been easy. The pregnancy had not been fully planned, and while there was joy, there was also pressure. She had confided in close friends about feeling stuck, unsure about the future of her relationship. She had mentioned emotional distance, short tempers, a growing feeling of being overwhelmed. Not abuse, at least not physical, but volatility. By the fifth day of the investigation, the headlines had started to settle into something disturbingly familiar. Another tragic figure, another domestic horror, another life cut short too soon. But for those piecing together the case from the inside, this wasn't a story designed for public consumption. This was a fragile, tangled puzzle of private anguish, unspoken tension, and the burden of expectations placed on a man the world thought it knew. At the Kansas City Police Department's homicide unit, a psychological profile was being assembled, not as a formality, but as a necessity. The crime was too calculated to be considered impulsive, and yet too emotionally loaded to be classified as cold-blooded. There were no accomplices, no signs of external coercion, no links to financial distress or gang affiliation. What they had instead was a picture forming slowly, shaded in grief, pride, pressure, and fear. Investigators turned their attention inward, to the mental state of the person at the center of it all. They began with a timeline, building backwards from the shootings to the earliest recorded behavioral changes. The result was unsettling. A pattern had emerged, not of open aggression, but of deterioration, a slow descent hidden beneath a life still outwardly in motion. Witness statements pointed to changes as early as the summer. Missed meetings, irritability, increasing detachment from friends and family, a subtle but growing reliance on alcohol. Multiple teammates reported that he had started sleeping in his car or occasionally on a couch at the Chiefs training facility. Not because of homelessness or injury, but because, according to one player, he said it was just easier than going home. The NFL is a machine built on discipline. It rewards control, punishes hesitation, and demands emotional suppression. In locker rooms across the country, the message is clear. Play hurt, stay silent, push through. To pause is to fall behind. To seek help is to show weakness. And for a man who had built his entire identity around overcoming odds, the idea of asking for support may have felt like erasing everything he had become. The police brought in a clinical forensic psychologist to help interpret the signs. What they discussed wasn't uncommon, but it was rarely addressed in public. Mask depression, particularly in high-functioning male athletes, often presents not through tears or confessions, but through disengagement, risk-taking behavior, emotional volatility, and eventually, if untreated, acts of violence, either toward others or the self. In Belcher's case, the warning signs were fragmented and subtle. No single moment stood out, but when viewed as a whole, the trajectory became clear. He was unraveling beneath the weight of an image he no longer recognized and a reality he couldn't control. The birth of his daughter, Zoe, had been a turning point. In his journal, recovered by police, a single entry 2 months earlier read, "I have to get it together. For her, I don't want to be my father." That last line struck investigators hard. His father, according to family sources, had been largely absent. Belcher had worked his entire life to build something different. But the fear of repeating history, of becoming what he had once resented, seemed to haunt him more deeply than anyone realized. Interviews with medical staff revealed that Belcher had suffered multiple documented concussions during his college and professional career. One had occurred just 7 weeks before the tragedy, during a particularly violent game. Though he had passed the standard concussion protocol at the time, recent studies had shown that repeated head trauma, especially in rapid succession, could contribute to chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE, a degenerative brain condition found in athletes who sustained regular blows to the head. CTE had become a flashpoint issue in professional sports, particularly in football. It was difficult to diagnose without post-mortem examination, but its symptoms were devastating. memory loss, impulsive behavior, paranoia, depression, emotional instability. One forensic psychiatrist referred to it as a time bomb lodged in the brain, unpredictable, undetectable, and unrelenting. At the time of the investigation, no official conclusion could be made about Belcher's neurological state. There was no autopsy yet focused on his brain tissue. But the speculation began quickly. Was this another case of undiagnosed brain damage driving an otherwise nonviolent person into a deadly spiral? Or was it something more nuanced? Psychological strain, untreated depression, the crushing pressure of holding together a life that felt increasingly fragile? There were no easy answers. But for investigators trying to understand not just the how, but the why, these questions mattered. The deeper they dug, the more they came to understand that the tragedy wasn't born in a moment. It was layered in years. The loss of identity, the fear of fatherhood, the performance of masculinity, the absence of emotional vocabulary, the inability to ask for help. These weren't excuses. They were context, and context matters, even in the face of irreversible loss. While police traced phone records, credit card transactions, and surveillance footage to lock down the physical sequence of events, the emotional timeline was built through fragments, voicemails, notes, conversations remembered differently by different people. Each detail, no matter how small, became a tile in a mosaic no one wished to complete. And yet it was Cassandra's voice, through those she had confided in, that remained clearest. She had loved him. She had wanted to believe things could improve, but she had also been afraid, not constantly, not even consistently, but intermittently, like someone sensing the wind shifting just before a storm breaks. She told me she wasn't sure she was safe, one friend recalled. She said she thought he loved her, but she wasn't sure he knew how to love without hurting. That statement struck a chord, because so often in cases of domestic homicide, there are no clear villains, only people, hurt people, struggling people, and ultimately people who run out of time to make different choices. For the team working the case, the focus remained on the facts. But in the back of their minds, one thought persisted, one they couldn't quite say out loud. What if he had asked for help? What if someone had listened harder? What if this wasn't inevitable but preventable? They couldn't rewind the clock, but maybe in understanding the past, they could build something better for those still here. By the end of the first week, the public was already growing restless for conclusions. Pundits on cable networks speculated nightly about motive. Op-ed columns wrestled with cultural meaning. The headlines had shifted from shock to interpretation, with phrases like troubled athlete, domestic tragedy, and warning signs filling the rotation. But inside the Kansas City Police Department's Special Investigation Unit, the work was far from over. In truth, this was the part of the process the public rarely saw. The long, slow excavation of details, where breakthroughs were measured not in confessions or dramatic reveals, but in subtle inconsistencies, overlooked items, and the quiet testimony of things people leave behind. Detectives began reprocessing the crime scene, not because they expected new evidence to appear, but because second passes often yield what the first may have missed. With the adrenaline gone, the eye becomes sharper. Emotions settle. Patterns emerge. In the bedroom, they revisited the shell casings. Ballistics had already matched them to a registered handgun found at the stadium. But investigators noticed something strange during a second mapping, the grouping of the shots. Cassandra had been shot 9 times, an excessive number in any homicide. Not just 1 or 2 to disable. 9. Deliberate, focused, almost ritualistic. The spacing of the shell casings also suggested movement, an arc that led from the bed to the bedroom doorway. She may have tried to flee, or plead, or both. But the scene told a story of someone who made a decision to finish what he had started. That mattered, not just legally but psychologically. It spoke to intent, to emotional state, to control or loss of it. The forensic team expanded their sweep, focusing on overlooked spaces. Inside a bathroom drawer tucked beneath unopened mail, they found a small flash drive. It contained old photos, nothing unusual, but buried in the digital files were several audio notes recorded via phone. Most were benign, reminders, thoughts, a few baby coos recorded during late nights. But one stood out. Dated 2 weeks prior to the shooting, the audio captured a man's voice, strained, tired, fragmented. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't breaking down. He was talking to himself. I feel like I'm trying to hold together 4 different lives: the player, the partner, the dad, the kid I was, and I don't know which one is real anymore. The clip lasted only 41 seconds, but it was enough. Not as proof of intent, not as a confession, but as a portrait of fragmentation, of someone who had already begun disassociating from his identity, a man unraveling from the inside while outwardly maintaining a schedule, a role, a mask. Investigators also retrieved texts from the weeks leading up to the incident. One thread between the deceased woman and her cousin stood out. "He's been quiet, like something's going on, but he won't say. I don't want to push him, but I'm also scared I'll push him by not asking." That paradox resonated with detectives. It was the impossible logic many victims of intimate partner violence face, not in the overt sense, but in the emotional balancing act of navigating someone they love who feels increasingly unstable. The forensic analysis of his vehicle revealed little. No sign of struggle, no trace of anyone else. But the glove compartment held another clue: a folded page, hand-torn from a notebook, with a name scribbled at the top. Zoe. Below it, a few lines of barely legible handwriting. As best investigators could reconstruct, it read, "You didn't ask to be here. I'm sorry I wasn't better. I love you forever." The letter was never delivered, perhaps never even finished, but it said more than enough. When police spoke again with his mother, the only living adult witness to the moments before the fatal act at home, she offered a new detail. In the hours before the shooting, she had noticed him pacing. He hadn't slept. She'd asked him if he was okay, and he had answered, "I just need to get my head straight." Then silence. Nothing more. He had gone into the bedroom. Minutes later, the shots. It was a moment, like so many in this case, that came back wrapped in hindsight. A throwaway phrase that could have meant anything or everything. The investigators met that night to cross-reference psychological analysis with physical evidence. What they had now wasn't just a timeline. It was a profile. A man drifting between personas, a woman trying to navigate emotional landmines, and a child caught in the middle of something she'd never understand. They began constructing a timeline that would become the foundation for all future legal summaries. It detailed the movements of the individuals involved, their communications, the evolution of behaviors. And yet, the deeper they went, the harder it became to explain why. Not because the facts were lacking, but because the emotions were so fractured. In the end, this wasn't a story of a sudden outburst. It was the culmination of many unspoken moments, of weight carried alone, of identity slowly worn down until it cracked. It was not just about what happened that morning, but what hadn't happened in the weeks, months, and perhaps years before. In this chapter of the investigation, the most powerful voices weren't those of witnesses or experts. They were in the pauses between texts, in the unfinished letters, in the audio fragments whispered into a phone. They were the echoes of a man losing his grip and a woman holding on for both of them. And as the detectives closed the files for the night, one thought returned again and again. Sometimes the things we leave behind are louder than anything we ever say. The tragedy that unfolded in Kansas City wasn't just an isolated rupture. It was the product of pressure built over time, unseen but palpable in hindsight. As detectives progressed into the second phase of the investigation, the focus shifted from evidence already gathered to the wider context surrounding it. Not just the personal history of those involved, but the structural patterns, cultural, professional, and systemic, that may have contributed to the fatal outcome. What started as a homicide investigation had grown into something more expansive, more uncomfortable, and far more revealing. Within police records and psychological profiles, one fact kept reemerging. This wasn't the first case in which a professional athlete had crossed the line from personal turmoil into public tragedy. The names were different, the locations varied, but the blueprint, emotional repression, physical trauma, sudden shifts in behavior, violence turned inward or outward, remained hauntingly familiar. Detectives reached out to national law enforcement databases and consulted with behavioral analysts experienced in crimes involving high-profile individuals. They began drawing connections between cases that, on the surface, seemed disconnected. And yet, when placed side by side, they formed a chilling sequence of echoing circumstances. There had been the former linebacker in Atlanta who drove his car into a retaining wall, his blood filled with alcohol and painkillers. A retired safety in San Diego who shot himself in the chest, leaving behind a note requesting his brain be studied for CTE. The wide receiver from the East Coast found dead in a hotel room, ruled a suicide, though his family insisted he was fine just days earlier. Each case had been reported in isolation, viewed as a singular tragedy. But taken together, they told a larger story about the human cost of performance, the violence of silence, and the burden of being strong for too long. In Kansas City, the investigative team reviewed academic studies on traumatic brain injuries. They consulted with experts from Boston University's CTE Research Center. What they discovered underscored a growing crisis. Chronic traumatic encephalopathy couldn't yet be diagnosed in the living, but its fingerprints were everywhere. In mood disorders, memory loss, impulsivity, aggression, and despair. The male figure at the center of this case had sustained multiple concussions throughout his playing career. Some documented, others suspected, but unreported. Each one, experts explained, was a blow not just to the skull, but to the intricate wiring of emotional regulation, judgment, and impulse control. In these cases, the line between mental illness and neurological damage was often blurred. The result wasn't always a complete break from reality, it was a slow erosion of it, a steady dimming of light that no one around could see clearly until it was gone. Detectives also returned to interview team psychologists and medical staff. One clinician, who had worked with players on a confidential basis, mentioned something chilling. You get used to hearing, "I'm good," even when you know they're not, and eventually you stop asking. There it was, the culture of silence, not enforced by policy, but by practice. A world where vulnerability was discouraged not out of cruelty, but survival, where seeking help could be interpreted as weakness, and weakness had no place in the game. Parallel to these findings, the detectives reviewed historical data on intimate partner violence across high-stress professions. What they found echoed what they'd already begun to suspect. While the majority of relationships within the league were stable, the rates of emotional volatility, control-based conflicts, and psychological aggression spiked in cases where mental health support was absent or stigmatized. They weren't looking for excuses. This was not about absolution, but understanding the road to violence meant more than just cataloging actions. It required seeing what led there. And then came a twist that recentered the case in a deeply personal way. A family member of the deceased woman came forward with an old voicemail she had saved on her phone. It had been left months earlier, in the middle of the night, and it hadn't seemed important at the time. Just a quick, half-coherent message. "Tell her I'm sorry I keep messing up. I'll do better. I'm trying, okay?" In the moment, it had felt like a typical dispute between a couple under stress. But in the context of everything that had followed, it took on a darker shade. Not because it was threatening, but because it was resigned. A man saying he was trying to be better, but already sounding like someone who didn't believe he could. From the outside, the couple had still been functioning, raising a child, making plans, attending events. But the cracks beneath that surface had widened, and there was no one there with the tools, or perhaps the permission, to help seal them. Detectives compiled everything: the physical evidence, the psychological profile, the cultural research, the testimony from family and friends. What they had now was more than a case file. It was a blueprint of a life unraveling in stages, not just in the days before the tragedy, but in the years preceding it. And so the question shifted from "why did this happen?" to "how many others are on this path?" What if this case wasn't the outlier, but a warning? A signal flare for those still fighting silent battles, still showing up to practice, still holding babies in their arms at night, trying to be everything for everyone, while slowly vanishing from themselves? The chapter closed not with a resolution, but with a reckoning, because the hardest part of this investigation wasn't solving what happened. It was accepting how many opportunities there had been to change it. and how society, fans, institutions, even loved ones had missed them all. In the days that followed the memorials, those moments carefully staged for cameras, with flowers placed on jerseys and helmets lowered in silence, investigators turned back toward the quiet heart of the case. They had processed the evidence, mapped the timeline, and interviewed the key players. But something lingered, a gap, a space between what was known and what still felt unresolved. And in that space stood a woman whose presence at the center of the crime had been strangely muted. Cheryl Shepard, the mother of the man who had committed the killing before ending his own life. She was the only adult in the house at the time of the shooting. The original interview with Cheryl had been understandably fragile. She was in shock. Her grandson had just lost both parents. Her son was dead. The woman who had lived in her home for months, Cassandra, was gone. What she recalled had been shared through tears, halting speech, and silence. But now, weeks later, the lead detective and a trained trauma interviewer sat with her again. Not with suspicion, but with precision. What emerged was more complicated than expected. She said she hadn't heard the argument escalate. She remembered Cassandra being in the bedroom, her son pacing. He was restless. Like he was somewhere else, she said. She remembered asking him what was wrong, and him replying, "I just need space." But what Cheryl hadn't shared initially, what she admitted now, was that she had considered calling the police before the shots rang out. Not because she thought a murder would happen, but because the energy in the room had changed. Something about the way her son had looked at Cassandra during an argument 2 days prior had unsettled her. It wasn't violent, she clarified, but it was cold, like he wasn't seeing her, just seeing through her. She had brushed it off. They were tired, new parents, tense. Who wouldn't be? And that is the tragedy. Not her fault, not her failure, but the reality that so often in domestic violence cases, the warning signs look like stress, like fatigue, like life, until they don't. One other detail from Cheryl's updated statement stopped the room cold. The day before the killing, she overheard part of a phone conversation, her son speaking to someone about wanting to get out of here, saying, "They'll all be better off." She hadn't asked him who he meant by they. That omission wasn't malicious. It was human. It was a mother hearing something too dark to believe. Meanwhile, outside the walls of grief and testimony, another narrative had taken over. On talk radio, hosts debated mental illness and masculinity. Cable panels speculated on what would happen to the child. Sports columns flipped between eulogies and cultural indictments. But behind the noise was a haunting quiet from the very institution most connected to the case, the NFL. The league, known for its precision in public messaging, offered condolences. A statement was released acknowledging the deep sorrow of the tragedy and reaffirming the league's commitment to supporting our players' health and well-being. But for many, it rang hollow, because behind the grief was a truth that few in power seemed willing to acknowledge. The NFL had long known about the risks, about the effects of head trauma, about the culture of silence, about the pressures placed on men to suppress everything but aggression. In private, league officials and union reps had scrambled. Legal departments reviewed language around liability. PR strategists debated how to frame the tragedy, whether to distance the organization from individual choices or use the moment to confront systemic flaws. But few within the investigation believed real accountability would follow. The detectives submitted a formal request to the league for all medical records related to the man at the center of the case. Some documentation arrived, but others were marked confidential, protected under internal health policies. In the background, lawyers began maneuvering. The league's priority, it seemed, was containment. The culture that had built the man's career, the one that praised his discipline, celebrated his toughness, and demanded his silence, was not prepared to own its part in his collapse. The media played its role too. In the first 48 hours after the murder-suicide, coverage focused heavily on the player, his stats, his trajectory, his struggle, and slowly, the woman he killed, Cassandra Perkins, was reduced to a footnote. It wasn't intentional, but it was revealing. Her name was often misspelled, her background glossed over. Very few outlets mentioned her ambitions, her family, her experiences. She became the girlfriend, not a woman with a voice, a future, and fears she had expressed to others in her final days. One national paper published an op-ed asking if the football player had been a victim too. The question was legitimate, but what was telling was how few asked who Cassandra had been, what dreams she had, what help she may have needed, what her story meant. In the weeks that followed, domestic violence advocates pushed back, not against understanding the player's psychological state, but against the erasure of the woman whose life had been taken. They asked a question that echoed through the investigative team as well. Can we tell the story of a man's unraveling without forgetting the woman whose life he ended? Back inside the precinct, the final case report was nearing completion. Evidence was laid out, timelines synchronized, witness statements corroborated, but the truth remained complex, full of contradictions, missed chances, and unanswered questions. The mother's updated testimony clarified certain emotional dynamics in the home. It offered insight, not closure. The league's silence, the media's framing, and the public's divided response painted a portrait of a society struggling to process a crime that did not fit neatly into any box. There were no monsters in this story, only humans, flawed, suffering, blinded by fear or love or pressure, and that made it harder to accept. This wasn't about blaming the NFL or Cheryl or teammates or fans. It was about seeing the full picture. A young woman whose life was erased, a man broken by systems that rewarded silence, and a child born into a legacy she never asked for. The investigation could conclude, but the story was far from over. The criminal investigation officially closed less than 2 months after it began. No charges would ever be filed. No trial would take place. The primary suspect was deceased. The victim, buried. Evidence reviewed, archived. Boxes labeled, shelved. But the story, what it meant, what it left behind, never really ended. In the quiet aftermath of the case, attention turned toward the smallest figure in the tragedy. The one who had no voice in what happened, no understanding of it, and yet bore the most innocent and unalterable consequence. Her name was Zoe. 3 months old when the violence shattered her world, she had been found in her crib that morning, alive, untouched, crying. She would never know her mother's touch again. She would never see her father's face except in photographs, accompanied by articles with headlines she would someday be old enough to read. The question no one wanted to ask, but everyone had to face was, what happens to a child born from this kind of story? Legal custody of Zoe became a complex matter. Both families wanted her. One side had lost a daughter, the other a son. Emotions were raw. There was grief, yes, but also a quiet war over narrative, over guilt, over identity. Courts became involved, mediation attempted, and through it all, the image of a baby passed from arms to arms remained suspended in the public mind, symbolizing something no legal system could ever properly resolve. Eventually, a trust was established by the NFL and the Kansas City Chiefs. It was intended to fund Zoe's education and future needs, drawing from her father's remaining salary and benefits. On paper, it was a gesture of compassion, of long-term care, but for many watching, it felt like an institutional bandage placed over a wound that went far deeper. Because how do you compensate for a legacy of absence? How do you reconcile the fact that this child would grow up one day to learn that her father had taken her mother's life, that he had then taken his own, that their final moments had played out just feet from where she slept? These aren't questions investigators can answer. They aren't legal matters either. They belong to the realm of the human heart. Zoe's story, like so many stories born from violence, will be shaped by the choices of those who raise her. The truth will not be hers to escape, but hopefully hers to understand, on her terms, in her time. And what she does with that truth will define not just who she is, but what this tragedy means beyond the crime scene. As the years passed, the case continued to appear in academic research, in documentaries about mental health in sports, in lectures on domestic violence. It was cited in legal journals, dissected in psychology courses. The names, Jovan Belcher and Cassandra Perkins, became case study headlines, shorthand for something larger. the silent crises hiding beneath exceptional lives. The NFL eventually faced further lawsuits involving player safety and traumatic brain injury. Concussion protocols were revised. Mental health programs were promoted more aggressively. Player assistance hotlines were expanded. But for many, these actions came too late or too cautiously, shadowed by decades of denial. What remained was a sobering reminder. Systems don't change because people die. They change when we admit we didn't listen soon enough. For those closest to the case, the families, the friends, the investigators, the emotional residue lingered long after the reports were filed. Detectives spoke of the crime not with horror, but with grief. Grief for what might have been prevented. Grief for the daughter who lost her parents. Grief for a couple who loved each other but didn't know how to live that love safely. There was no villain in the traditional sense. No courtroom drama, no verdict. Only a long pause, and then the slow work of making sense of the unthinkable. In the end, this wasn't a story about football or even about violence. It was a story about the weight of silence, the silence of men taught to perform strength instead of process pain, the silence of women afraid to speak too loudly when something feels off, the silence of institutions that profit from endurance but invest little in healing, and the silence of a baby's cry, muffled by a future she had no choice in inheriting. Some crimes leave behind scars you can see, bodies, blood, broken windows. Others leave behind questions, unfinished conversations, emotional fault lines that ripple through generations. The home on Chrysler Avenue has long been sold. New tenants live there now. Perhaps they've repainted the walls, covered the scars. But those who were there that morning, those who touched that history, know the house remembers, and so do we. Because in telling this story, honestly and without spectacle, we don't just relive the crime, we recognize the fractures in our own culture. And maybe, just maybe, we begin to ask better questions. Not just, how did this happen? But who else is hurting right now and hasn't said a word? Thank you for watching our video. Please subscribe, follow us, and leave a comment. It truly helps us keep bringing you gripping and thought-provoking true crime stories.